In the summer of 1981, something invisible began to kill. It didn't announce itself with fanfare or warning. It moved through the shadows of New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco like smoke through cracks in a door. Young men, vibrant and full of life one month, were skeletal ghosts the next. Doctors stood in hospital rooms, utterly baffled, watching patients waste away from diseases that shouldn't have been able to touch them. A rare cancer that painted purple lesions across skin like grotesque watercolors. Pneumonia that drowned lungs slowly, inexorably. And nobody, absolutely nobody, knew why. The beginning of the end started so quietly that most people didn't even notice. But for those who were paying attention, for those who saw the first whispers of something catastrophically wrong, there was a feeling in the air. A feeling that the world was about to change in ways that nobody could possibly imagine. And they were right. What was coming would reshape medicine, redefine sexuality, transform politics, and kill tens of millions of people across the globe. This is the story of how humanity faced its most terrifying modern plague, and how we barely survived it. The year is 1981. Ronald Reagan had just taken office as the 40th President of the United States. MTV launched that August, changing music forever. Indiana Jones swung across movie screens in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The world felt like it was entering a new era of possibility and optimism. But in the corridors of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, a peculiar report landed on a desk that would shatter that optimism into a million pieces. Dr. Michael Gottlieb, an immunologist at UCLA, had noticed something deeply strange. 5 young men, all previously healthy, all gay, had come down with a rare form of pneumonia called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or PCP. Now, PCP wasn't unheard of, but it was the kind of infection you only saw in people whose immune systems were completely shot. Cancer patients on chemotherapy, organ transplant recipients on immunosuppressive drugs. Not healthy young men in their 20s and 30s, who should have been able to fight off just about anything. Dr. Gottlieb wrote up his findings and sent them to the CDC. On June 5, 1981, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a publication that most Americans had never heard of and would never read, published a brief article about these 5 cases. 5 cases, that was it, just 5 mysterious infections in Los Angeles. The article was dry, clinical, barely 2 pages long. It mentioned the patient's sexual orientation almost as an afterthought. Nobody outside the medical community paid much attention. But in New York City, Dr. Alvin Friedman Keene was seeing something equally disturbing. Young gay men were showing up at his dermatology clinic with Kaposi's sarcoma, a rare cancer that caused purple or brown lesions on the skin. Kaposi's sarcoma was so uncommon that most dermatologists might see one case in their entire career, and when they did, it was usually in elderly Mediterranean men or organ transplant patients. But Friedman Keene was seeing it in patient after patient. Young men, healthy men, or at least men who had been healthy until these lesions started appearing. By July 1981, the CDC had reports of 26 cases of this strange immune deficiency. All of them were gay men. All of them were experiencing infections that their bodies should have been able to fight off without breaking a sweat. The medical community started calling it GRID, an acronym that would soon become infamous and deeply offensive: Gay-related immune deficiency. The name itself was a mistake, a terrible assumption that would have devastating consequences. Because while the first recognized cases were among gay men, the disease didn't give a damn about anyone's sexual orientation. It was an equal opportunity killer, and it was just getting started. In those early months, the gay community in cities like San Francisco and New York began to whisper about what they called the gay cancer, or the gay plague. Men would notice friends becoming sick, losing weight, developing strange infections. The bathhouses and clubs that had been centers of liberation and joy in the post-Stonewall era began to feel haunted. Someone you danced with last month would be in the hospital this month. Someone you saw at a party would be dead by Christmas. The fear was palpable, but so was the confusion. Nobody understood what was happening. Was it something in the environment? Was it poppers, the amyl nitrite that many gay men used recreationally? Was it the sheer number of sexual partners that some men had? Was it a new STD? Theories flew around, each more terrifying than the last, because the truth was that nobody had a clue. And when people don't know what's killing them, fear becomes a living thing that grows in the darkness. Dr. James Curran at the CDC was assigned to lead the task force investigating these cases. Curran was an epidemiologist, someone who studied patterns of disease, and the pattern he was seeing was deeply troubling. By the end of 1981, there were 270 reported cases of this immune deficiency. 121 of those patients were already dead. The death rate was staggering. Whatever this thing was, it was incredibly efficient at killing. But here's where the story takes a turn that would define the entire epidemic for years to come. The Reagan administration, along with much of conservative America, had a complicated relationship with the gay community. This was the early 1980s. Homosexuality had only been removed from the American Psychiatric Association's list of mental disorders in 1973. Sodomy laws were still on the books in many states. The religious right was gaining political power, and their message was clear. Homosexuality was a sin, an abomination, a choice that led people away from God. When news of this gay plague started to spread, there was a segment of the population that saw it as divine retribution. Preachers stood in pulpits and declared that God was punishing the wicked. Conservative commentators suggested that this was nature's way of dealing with an unnatural lifestyle. The cruelty was breathtaking. People were dying, and instead of compassion, they were met with condemnation. The federal government's response, or lack thereof, spoke volumes. There was no rush to fund research, no urgent press conferences. President Reagan wouldn't even publicly mention AIDS until 1985, 4 years into the epidemic, when more than 5,000 Americans had already died. The silence from the White House was deafening. It was as if the administration had made a calculated decision that these deaths didn't matter because the people dying didn't matter. But while politicians were silent, doctors and researchers were scrambling. In 1982, the disease got a new name: AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. The change in terminology was important because by this point, cases were starting to appear in people who weren't gay men, hemophiliacs who received blood transfusions, intravenous drug users who shared needles, Haitian immigrants, heterosexual women. The disease was spreading, and it was becoming clear that sexual orientation had nothing to do with vulnerability. Anyone could get it. The question that haunted researchers was simple and terrifying. How was it spreading? They knew it wasn't casual contact. You couldn't get it from touching someone or being in the same room, but it was clearly transmissible through some kind of exchange. The evidence pointed to blood and sexual fluids. But what exactly was in those fluids? What was the infectious agent? In 1983, 2 research teams made a discovery that would change everything. Dr. Luc Montagnier at the Pasteur Institute in Paris isolated a virus from the lymph node of a patient with AIDS. He called it LAV, lymphadenopathy-associated virus. Around the same time, Dr. Robert Gallo at the National Cancer Institute in the United States identified what he called HTLVII, human T lymphotropic virus type III. There was controversy, competition, and eventually a bitter dispute about who discovered the virus first. But the important thing was this: they had found the culprit, a retrovirus that attacked the body's T cells, the very cells that were supposed to coordinate the immune response. The virus would later be renamed HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effect. HIV invaded CD4 T cells, the white blood cells that act like generals in the immune system's army. Once inside, the virus hijacked the cell's machinery, using it to make copies of itself. In the process, it destroyed the cell. Slowly, methodically, HIV decimated the immune system from within. And when the immune system finally collapsed, the body became vulnerable to opportunistic infections and cancers that would normally never gain a foothold. That's when AIDS developed. AIDS was the end point, the final stage, when the body had lost its ability to defend itself against anything. Understanding the virus was one thing, stopping it was something else entirely. There was no cure, no vaccine, no treatment that could slow the virus down, let alone eliminate it. A diagnosis of HIV was a death sentence. Patients and doctors both knew it. The only question was how long someone had before the inevitable end. And the dying was brutal. This wasn't a quick death. AIDS patients wasted away over months or years. They developed infections that caused unimaginable suffering. Cytomegalovirus that caused blindness, toxoplasmosis that attacked the brain, candida that coated the mouth and throat, Mycobacterium avium complex that ravaged the intestines. And through it all, the lesions of Kaposi's sarcoma spread across skin, marking patients with visible signs of their disease. Hospitals didn't know how to handle AIDS patients. There was fear among healthcare workers. Some refused to treat AIDS patients, worried about contagion despite evidence that casual contact was safe. Patients were sometimes isolated in ways that went far beyond necessary precautions. Stories emerged of food trays being left outside doors, of nurses wearing multiple layers of gloves and masks to deliver medication, of dying patients being left alone because people were too afraid to sit with them. The stigma was crushing. People with AIDS faced discrimination at every level. They lost their jobs when employers found out about their diagnosis. They were evicted from their apartments. Insurance companies refused to cover them or dropped their policies. Families disowned them. Some patients died alone, estranged from everyone they had ever loved, victims not just of a virus, but of society's fear and prejudice. But out of this darkness came something remarkable. The gay community, which bore the brunt of the epidemic in those early years, organized. They created support networks when the government wouldn't. They cared for their sick when hospitals turned them away. They demanded action when politicians remained silent. In 1982, Larry Kramer and a group of men in New York City founded Gay Men's Health Crisis, or GMHC. It started in Kramer's living room with a handful of people and grew into the world's first and largest AIDS service organization. GMHC provided services that nobody else would. They offered counseling, support groups, legal assistance. They created a buddy system where volunteers would help people with AIDS with daily tasks like grocery shopping, cooking, cleaning, going to medical appointments. When someone was dying and had nobody else, a GMHC volunteer would be there. The Terence Higgins Trust was established in the UK in 1982, named after one of the first British people to die of AIDS. In San Francisco, the AIDS Emergency Fund was created. These grassroots organizations became lifelines for thousands of people. They operated on shoestring budgets, powered by volunteers who were themselves often HIV positive, working tirelessly while dealing with their own declining health. And then there was the political activism. Larry Kramer, who would become one of the most prominent AIDS activists in America, wrote a furious essay in 1983 titled 1112 and Counting, referring to the number of AIDS deaths at that point. In it, he accused the government, the medical establishment, and even parts of the gay community of criminal neglect. He wrote, "If this article doesn't scare the shit out of you, we're in real trouble." The essay was a call to arms, a demand that people wake up and realize that inaction was killing them. In 1987, Kramer and others founded ACTUP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Their motto was simple and powerful: silence equals death. ACTUP engaged in direct action protests that were impossible to ignore. They staged die-ins at government buildings, with activists lying down on the ground to represent the dead. They shut down the FDA to demand faster approval processes for experimental AIDS drugs. They disrupted pharmaceutical company meetings to protest the high cost of medications. They invaded the New York Stock Exchange. They were angry, they were loud, and they refused to die quietly. One of ACTUP's most iconic actions came in 1988, when they targeted the headquarters of the Food and Drug Administration in Rockville, Maryland. Over 1,000 activists descended on the FDA, blocking entrances, chaining themselves to buildings, demanding that the agency speed up its drug approval process. AIDS patients were dying because potentially life-saving medications were stuck in trials that could take years to complete. ACTUP argued that when you're dying, you don't have years to wait for bureaucrats to finish their paperwork. The protest worked. The FDA created new protocols for fast-tracking drugs for life-threatening diseases. Even as activists fought for recognition and resources, the epidemic was spreading globally. Africa was being devastated. In countries like Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, entire generations were being wiped out. The virus spread through heterosexual contact, and because of poverty, lack of healthcare infrastructure, and limited education about prevention, it spread like wildfire. Villages were left with only the very young and the very old, because everyone in between was dead or dying. In some African communities, AIDS killed so many people that there weren't enough adults left to plant and harvest crops. Orphans, children who had lost both parents to AIDS, numbered in the millions. These kids raised themselves, raised their younger siblings, struggled to survive in a world that had taken everything from them. The scale of the tragedy was almost incomprehensible. Asia was facing its own epidemic. In Thailand, India, and China, HIV spread through sex work, drug use, and contaminated blood supplies. The cultural stigma around discussing sex and drug use meant that prevention efforts were hampered. People didn't talk about AIDS because talking about AIDS meant talking about behaviors that were considered shameful or illegal. So the virus spread silently, claiming victims who often didn't even know they were at risk. In the United States, the epidemic continued to evolve. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that HIV was spreading beyond the initial high-risk groups. Heterosexual transmission was documented. Women were getting infected, and when pregnant women had HIV, they could pass it to their Barbies during pregnancy, childbirth, or breastfeeding. The idea that AIDS was a gay disease was falling apart, but the stigma remained. The blood supply became a major concern. Before HIV testing was available, blood banks had no way to screen donations. Hemophiliacs, people with a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly, required regular infusions of clotting factor derived from donated blood. One batch of clotting factor could contain plasma from thousands of donors. If even one of those donors was HIV positive, the entire batch was contaminated. Thousands of hemophiliacs became infected with HIV through the very treatment that kept them alive. Ryan White became the face of this tragedy. He was a teenager from Indiana who had hemophilia. In 1984, he was diagnosed with AIDS after receiving contaminated blood products. When his school found out, they tried to ban him from attending classes. Parents of other students were terrified that their children would catch AIDS from Ryan. They didn't understand the science. They didn't understand that HIV couldn't spread through casual contact. All they knew was fear. Ryan and his mother fought back. They took the school to court and won the right for Ryan to attend classes. But the harassment didn't stop. People threatened the White family. Bullets were fired through their windows. They were forced to leave their hometown and start over somewhere else. Ryan became an activist, speaking publicly about AIDS, helping to educate people about how the virus was actually transmitted. He met celebrities, appeared on television, testified before Congress. He put a human, sympathetic face on a disease that many people preferred to demonize. Ryan White died in 1990, just a few months before his high school graduation. He was 18 years old, but his legacy lived on. The Ryan White Care Act, passed by Congress later that year, provided federal funding for AIDS treatment and services. It remains the largest federal program specifically for people living with HIV/AIDS. The stories of loss were everywhere, families destroyed, talent extinguished. The arts community was particularly hard hit. Actors, dancers, artists, musicians, writers all died young. The creative energy of an entire generation was snuffed out. Broadway theaters dimmed their lights in tribute over and over again. Art galleries held memorial exhibitions. The cultural landscape was scarred by absence, by all the work that would never be created, all the performances that would never happen, all the potential that was buried in cemeteries from coast to coast. Fashion designer Halston died of AIDS in 1990. Choreographer Alvin Ailey in 1989. Artist Keith Haring in 1990. Freddie Mercury, the legendary frontman of Queen, died in 1991. Rudolf Nureyev, one of the greatest ballet dancers of the 20th century, died in 1993. Each death was a tragedy. Each death left a hole in the world. But it wasn't just the famous who mattered. It was the thousands upon thousands of ordinary people. The nurses and teachers and accountants and construction workers. The parents and children and partners. Every single person who died of AIDS had a story, had people who loved them, had dreams that would never be fulfilled. The sheer scale of the loss became numbing. How do you grieve for millions? How do you comprehend tragedy on that magnitude? The AIDS Memorial Quilt became one way to remember. Started in 1987 by activist Cleve Jones, the quilt was a way to memorialize those who had died and to make the immense number of deaths visible. Each panel was 3 feet by 6 feet, the size of a grave. Friends and family members created panels for their loved ones, decorating them with photos, fabric, letters, inside jokes, anything that captured the essence of the person they had lost. The panels were sewn together into a massive quilt that grew larger with each passing month. In October 1987, the quilt was displayed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It covered a space larger than a football field and included 1,920 panels. People walked among the panels, reading names, crying, remembering. The Names Project, as it was called, continued to grow. By 1996, the quilt had more than 40,000 panels and weighed over 50 tons. It was too large to be displayed all at once. Sections of it traveled around the country, bringing the reality of AIDS to communities everywhere. Meanwhile, the search for treatment continued. In 1987, the FDA approved the first antiretroviral drug for HIV. It was called AZT, or azidothymidine. AZT had originally been developed as a cancer treatment in the 1960s, but had been shelved because it didn't work. Researchers discovered that it could inhibit HIV's ability to replicate. It wasn't a cure. It didn't eliminate the virus, but it slowed it down. For the first time, there was something doctors could prescribe that actually did something against HIV. The problem was that AZT was far from perfect. It had serious side effects including nausea, muscle pain, and damage to bone marrow. Worse, HIV quickly developed resistance to it. Patients would take AZT, see some improvement, and then the virus would adapt and the drug would stop working. Still, it was better than nothing. It gave people hope, even if that hope was fragile. The pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome, which manufactured AZT, charged an astronomical price for the drug. The annual cost was around $10,000 per patient, making it one of the most expensive drugs in the world at the time. Activists were furious. The company was profiting from a pandemic, pricing medication out of reach for many of the people who needed it most. ACT UP organized protests demanding that Burroughs Wellcome lower the price. Eventually, the company reduced the cost, but the episode highlighted the tension between pharmaceutical profits and patient access that continues to this day. Other drugs followed. DDI, DDC, D4T each was another nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor, working in similar ways to AZT. Each had side effects. Each faced resistance. Doctors started using combination therapy, giving patients multiple drugs at once, hoping that the virus couldn't develop resistance to all of them simultaneously. It helped, but people were still dying. The early 1990s were dark years. The epidemic was at its peak in the United States. In 1995, AIDS was the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 25 and 44. 44. Think about that for a second. An entire demographic, people in the prime of their lives, were being wiped out. The impact on communities was staggering. In some neighborhoods in cities like San Francisco and New York, it seemed like everyone knew someone who had died, or was dying, or was HIV positive themselves. The emotional toll was indescribable. Survivors' guilt plagued those who remained healthy while friends around them fell sick. People spoke of AIDS fatigue, an exhaustion that came from attending too many funerals, seeing too much suffering, grieving too much loss. Some activists burned out completely, unable to continue fighting when the cost was so high. Others kept going, driven by rage or love or sheer stubborn refusal to give up. And then in 1996, everything changed. The International AIDS Conference in Vancouver, a researcher named David Ho presented data on a new approach to HIV treatment. It was called Highly Active Antiretroviral Therapy, or HAART. The idea was to use 3 or more drugs from different classes, attacking the virus at multiple points in its life cycle. The results were stunning. Patients who had been wasting away started to gain weight. Their viral loads, the amount of virus in their blood, dropped to undetectable levels. Their immune systems began to recover. It felt like a miracle. The Lazarus effect, they called it, after the biblical figure who rose from the dead. People who had been planning their funerals were suddenly thinking about next year, next decade, the rest of their lives. The cocktail, as the combination therapy became known, wasn't a cure. It required taking multiple pills every day, sometimes dozens of pills on complicated schedules. The side effects could be brutal, but it worked. It kept people alive. The impact was immediate and dramatic. AIDS deaths in the United States dropped by 47% between 1996 and 1997. It was the first time since the epidemic began that deaths decreased rather than increased. The sense of relief was overwhelming. After 15 years of watching people die with no way to stop it, finally, there was something that worked. But here's the thing about miracles: they're not evenly distributed. HAART was expensive. In the United States and other wealthy countries, most people with HIV could eventually access the medications through insurance, government programs, or drug assistance programs. But in Africa, where the epidemic was catastrophic, where millions of people were infected, the drugs were out of reach. The annual cost of HAART could be $10,000 or more per patient. In countries where the average income was a few $100s a year, that price might as well have been $1 billion. So a cruel divide emerged. In the developed world, HIV became a manageable chronic condition. People took their pills and lived relatively normal lives. But in sub-Saharan Africa, the dying continued. More than that, it accelerated. By the late 1990s, more than 20 million people in Africa were living with HIV. Millions of them would die without ever having access to the medications that could save them. The injustice was staggering. Geography shouldn't determine whether you live or die. But in the case of HIV, it absolutely did. Activists and humanitarian organizations began demanding that pharmaceutical companies lower drug prices for poor countries. The companies resisted, arguing that they needed to recoup research and development costs. The debate became heated, with accusations of greed on one side and concerns about intellectual property protections on the other. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a few things began to shift the equation. Generic drug manufacturers in countries like India and Brazil started producing antiretroviral medications at a fraction of the cost charged by Western pharmaceutical companies. A year's worth of HAART that cost $10,000 from a brand name manufacturer could be produced for a few $100s by a generic manufacturer. Suddenly, treatment for millions became theoretically possible. The fight over drug patents and access to medicines became one of the defining global health battles of the era. In 2001, the South African government, supported by activists and international organizations, took on the pharmaceutical industry in court. The case centered on South Africa's right to import or produce generic versions of patented AIDS drugs. The pharmaceutical companies argued that this violated intellectual property law. The world watched. And under intense public pressure, the pharmaceutical companies backed down. They withdrew their lawsuit and began offering drugs to poor countries at reduced prices. It was a watershed moment. The precedent established that saving lives could take precedence over patent protections in cases of public health emergency. Programs like the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, launched by President George W. Bush in 2003, began to fund large-scale treatment programs in Africa and other hard-hit regions. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria mobilized billions of dollars. Slowly, painstakingly, treatment began to reach the people who needed it most. The expansion of treatment access saved millions of lives. Countries that had been losing teachers, nurses, doctors, parents, and children to AIDS began to stabilize. In places where antiretroviral therapy became widely available, new HIV infections started to decline because treatment reduced viral load, which reduced the likelihood of transmission. People who might have died were living, working, raising families. But let's not pretend it was enough, or that it happened fast enough, or that everyone got what they needed. Millions still died waiting for treatment that came too late. The infrastructure to deliver medications and monitor patients was often inadequate. Stigma remained a massive barrier, preventing people from getting tested or seeking treatment because they were afraid of discrimination. And resistance to drugs, caused by inconsistent medication adherence or inadequate treatment regimens, created new challenges. In the United States and other wealthy countries, the epidemic was changing shape. By the 2000s, HIV was increasingly concentrated among marginalized communities. African American men who have sex with men faced infection rates that were off the charts. Transgender women, particularly trans women of color, had some of the highest HIV prevalence rates of any demographic. Injection drug users continued to face high risks. Poverty, lack of access to healthcare, systemic racism, homophobia, and transphobia all created conditions where HIV could thrive. The tools for prevention improved. Condoms had been the primary prevention method since the epidemic began. Education campaigns, from safe sex to abstinence-only programs that completely failed to address reality, attempted to change behavior with mixed success. Needle exchange programs, which provided clean syringes to injection drug users, were proven to reduce HIV transmission, but they faced political opposition from people who saw them as enabling drug use rather than preventing disease. 2012, a game-changing prevention tool became available. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, was approved by the FDA. PrEP involves HIV-negative people taking a daily pill that contains antiretroviral medications. When taken consistently, PrEP reduces the risk of getting HIV from sex by about 99%. It was revolutionary. For the first time, people at high risk of HIV infection could take control of their own prevention. But once again, access was an issue. PrEP was expensive, insurance coverage was inconsistent, and awareness was low, particularly among the communities that could benefit most. Efforts to expand PrEP access continue, but uptake has been slower than many had hoped. Cultural barriers, medical mistrust, and logistical challenges all play a role. Testing advanced as well. Rapid HIV tests that could provide results in 20 minutes became available. This was crucial because many people who got tested never came back for their results when it took days or weeks. Immediate results meant immediate linkage to care for those who tested positive. Home testing kits allowed people to test themselves in private, reducing one barrier to knowing your status. Treatment as prevention became a cornerstone of HIV control efforts. Scientists proved that people with HIV who take their medications and maintain an undetectable viral load cannot transmit the virus sexually. Undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U. This finding was monumental. It meant that treatment wasn't just about keeping individuals healthy, it was a prevention strategy for entire communities. If you're still with me on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in modern history, I want to pause for just a moment. The story we're telling here on Dreamless Timelines is one that deserves to be heard, remembered, and understood. If you're finding value in this deep dive into history, if these stories are resonating with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button, leave a comment about what aspects of history you'd like us to explore next. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important narratives to light, and it lets us know we're creating content that matters to you. Now, where were we? Right, the evolution of treatment and prevention. By the 2010s, the HIV landscape looked dramatically different than it had in the 1980s. People were living long, healthy lives with HIV. The medications had improved significantly. Pills that once numbered in the dozens had been consolidated into single-tablet regimens taken once a day. Side effects, while still present, were generally more manageable. The specter of imminent death that had haunted an HIV diagnosis for so long had largely faded, at least in countries with good healthcare access. But the virus was far from defeated. Approximately 38 million people worldwide were living with HIV by 2020. About half of them were accessing treatment. The other half, nearly 20 million people, were not. Sub-Saharan Africa continued to bear the greatest burden, accounting for more than 2/3 of people living with HIV globally. The populations most affected had shifted but remained vulnerable. Young women in Africa faced disproportionately high infection rates. Men who have sex with men remained at elevated risk everywhere in the world. Sex workers, people who inject drugs, prisoners, and transgender individuals faced not only high HIV risk, but also criminalization, violence, and exclusion from healthcare services. Stigma, that ancient enemy, persisted in insidious ways. People with HIV still faced discrimination in employment, housing, and healthcare. Dating, while HIV-positive carried disclosure dilemmas and rejection. HIV criminalization laws in many jurisdictions made it a crime to have sex without disclosing your status, even if transmission was impossible because of effective treatment. These laws were based on fear and outdated science, not evidence, but they remained on the books, ruining lives and discouraging people from getting tested. The psychological impact of living through the AIDS epidemic left deep scars on those who survived. PTSD was common among long-term survivors who had watched entire social circles die. The generation of gay men who came of age in the 1980s and 1990s carried trauma that shaped their entire lives. They lived when so many didn't. They navigated a world that told them they were disposable, that their deaths didn't matter. And even as treatments improved, that trauma didn't just disappear. There's a concept in the survivor community called living in the meanwhile. It refers to the way many long-term survivors never fully believed they had a future, even after HAART made survival possible. They had spent years preparing to die. They had planned funerals, written wills, said goodbyes, and then suddenly they didn't die. But they were left in a strange limbo, alive but not quite able to imagine a real future, living in the meanwhile between death sentences and actual life. The AIDS epidemic also fundamentally changed medicine and public health. It transformed the relationship between patients and the healthcare system. Before AIDS, patients generally trusted doctors and followed their recommendations. But AIDS patients, facing a medical establishment that often didn't know how to help them and a government that seemed indifferent to their dying, took matters into their own hands. They educated themselves about virology and immunology. They demanded seats at the table when treatment decisions were being made. They challenged drug approval processes and research methodologies. This patient activism revolutionized how clinical trials were conducted. AIDS activists argued that the gold standard of randomized controlled trials, where some patients get the experimental drug and some get a placebo, was unethical when people were dying and there were no other treatment options. Why should anyone get a sugar pill when there was even a chance that the experimental drug might help? Their advocacy led to changes in trial design, including allowing patients on placebo to cross over to the active drug if it showed benefit. The community input model that AIDS activists pioneered has since been adopted for other diseases. Breast cancer advocacy, for example, was directly influenced by lessons learned from AIDS activism. Patients with other conditions have demanded and received greater involvement in research priorities and drug development. The paternalistic model of medicine, where doctors knew best and patients simply complied, was permanently altered. AIDS also accelerated the development of antiviral medications as a field. Before HIV, there were very few effective antiviral drugs. Antibiotics had revolutionized bacterial infections, but viruses were harder to target without harming the host. The urgent need to treat HIV drove innovation in antiviral research. The techniques and knowledge gained from developing HIV medications have since been applied to other viruses. The rapid development of COVID-19 antivirals, for instance, built on decades of antiviral research that HIV made necessary. The social and political legacy of the epidemic is equally profound. The AIDS crisis forced conversations about sexuality, drug use, healthcare access, and discrimination that American society had been avoiding. It revealed the fault lines of inequality and the consequences of marginalizing vulnerable populations. It showed what happens when government is slow to respond to threats facing communities it doesn't value. The activism born from AIDS created a blueprint for social movements. ACTUP's confrontational tactics, their media savvy, their ability to mobilize quickly and disrupt business as usual, influenced everything from environmental activism to Black Lives Matter. The idea that silence equals death, that injustice must be confronted loudly and publicly, became a template for demanding change. The epidemic changed the gay community in ways that are still being understood. In the 1970s, post-Stonewall, there was a sense of liberation and possibility. Gay men were coming out, building visible communities, claiming public space. The bathhouses and clubs weren't just about sex, they were about creating spaces where gay people could exist freely. AIDS threatened to destroy all of that. The community had to simultaneously fight for survival and fight for the right to exist as they were. There was tension within the community about how to respond. Some argued that gay men needed to change their sexual behavior radically, that promiscuity had brought the epidemic upon them. Others fiercely defended sexual liberation, arguing that shame and repression were the real enemies. These debates could be brutal, pitting friends against each other, creating rifts that sometimes never healed. But there was also incredible solidarity. The care networks that emerged, the way people showed up for each other in the darkest times, created bonds that were unbreakable. Gay men who might have lived individualistic lives before AIDS became caregivers, advocates, warriors. They learned to navigate Byzantine medical systems, to advocate for partners in hospitals that didn't recognize their relationships, to comfort friends through their final hours. Lesbians played an extraordinary role that often goes unrecognized. While AIDS primarily affected gay and bisexual men in the early years, lesbians stepped up in massive numbers to care for the sick. They volunteered in AIDS organizations, they organized blood drives, they provided hospice care. Many had their own experiences with medical discrimination and understood what it meant to be marginalized. They showed up when almost nobody else would, bridging divides within the LGBTQ community and demonstrating profound solidarity. The families of AIDS patients faced their own painful journeys. Some families rejected their sons when they were diagnosed, unable or unwilling to overcome their prejudices, even as their child was dying. Others discovered reserves of love they didn't know they had. Parents who had struggled to accept their child's sexuality found themselves becoming fierce advocates, learning about T-cell counts and viral loads, fighting with insurance companies and hospitals, ultimately losing their child, but finding a kind of peace in having been there at the end. The phrase family of choice took on deep meaning during the AIDS years. When biological families abandoned people with AIDS, chosen families stepped in. Partners, friends, ex-lovers, people who had built their own kinship networks became the ones sitting at bedsides, making medical decisions, planning funerals. These chosen families had no legal standing in many cases. Partners of decades couldn't make medical decisions for each other. They were excluded from hospital rooms by biological family members who had been absent for years. Inheritance and property became battlegrounds as blood relatives swooped in after death to claim belongings, sometimes even evicting surviving partners from homes they had shared for years. These injustices sparked legal battles that would eventually contribute to the push for marriage equality. If gay couples had been allowed to marry, many of these problems would have been solved. Partners would have had legal rights. They would have had access to each other in hospitals. They would have inherited property automatically. The AIDS crisis made the inequality of not being able to marry painfully concrete. It wasn't abstract politics anymore. It was about whether you could sit with your dying partner or whether you'd be turned away at the hospital door. The memorial services during the peak years of the epidemic were unlike anything else. Churches and community centers held services where dozens, sometimes hundreds of names were read. Entire friend groups were memorialized together. People in their 20s and 30s attended more funerals than their grandparents had. The rituals of grief became routine in the most horrifying way. But there was also fierce celebration of life. Memorial services weren't just summer affairs. They included drag performances, disco music, comedy, celebration of the joy and creativity and fabulousness of the people who had died. Because if AIDS taught anything, it was that life is precious and brief, and should be lived fully and authentically. The people who died of AIDS had often lived more genuinely, more bravely than many people who lived twice as long. The guilt of survival weighed heavily on those who remained negative or who, against all odds, progressed slowly or not at all. There are people called elite controllers, whose immune systems somehow keep HIV in check without medication. There are long-term non-progressors who remain healthy years after infection. For some of these individuals, being alive when so many others died felt incomprehensible. Why them? Why not their partner, their best friend, the person who deserved life just as much? This survivor's guilt was compounded by the randomness of who got infected and who didn't. People who had been extremely cautious got HIV. People who had engaged in high-risk behavior remained negative. There was no moral calculus that explained who got sick and who didn't. The virus didn't care about goodness or worthiness. It just spread. As the epidemic stretched into the 1990s and beyond, a new generation of gay men came of age with a completely different relationship to AIDS. For those who came out in the 2000s or 2010s, HIV was a manageable chronic illness, not an immediate death sentence. They had grown up seeing ads for HIV medications on television, showing healthy, active people living full lives. The terror that had defined the 1980s was history to them, not lived experience. This generational divide created tension. Older survivors sometimes felt that younger gay men didn't understand the stakes, didn't appreciate the battles that had been fought, didn't take prevention seriously enough because they believed treatment would save them. Younger men sometimes felt judged or lectured by an older generation that didn't understand how much things had changed. There's truth on both sides. The availability of treatment has genuinely transformed HIV from a death sentence to a chronic condition. That's miraculous and worth celebrating. But the trauma of the AIDS years, the loss, the fear, the fighting, that's part of LGBTQ history that shouldn't be forgotten. The people who died, the activists who fought when nobody else would, they paved the way for younger generations to live more freely. The question of memory and memorialization became increasingly important as time passed. How do you make sure that millions of deaths aren't forgotten? How do you pass down the history of the epidemic to people who didn't live through it? The AIDS memorial quilt served this purpose, but it was too large to display all at once. Documentaries like How to Survive a Plague and United in Anger captured the history of activism. Books like And the Band Played On by Randy Schultz chronicled the early years of the epidemic. Plays like Angels in America by Tony Kushner brought the reality of AIDS to stages around the world. Education in schools remained inadequate. Comprehensive sex education that included honest information about HIV prevention was opposed in many communities. Abstinence-only programs that refused to discuss condoms or other prevention methods left young people vulnerable. The politicization of HIV prevention, where ideology took precedence over evidence, cost lives. It's still costing lives. Internationally, the epidemic continued to evolve in complex ways. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, HIV spread rapidly among people who inject drugs, fueled by limited access to harm reduction services and punitive drug policies. In Southeast Asia, sex work and migration patterns created epidemic hotspots. In Latin America and the Caribbean, infection rates varied widely by country, with some areas making significant progress while others struggled. Russia became a concerning example of how stigma and government policy could undermine HIV response. The Russian government promoted a model that emphasized drug-free treatment for addiction and opposed harm reduction approaches like needle exchange and medication-assisted treatment with methadone. This ideological stance, combined with discrimination against LGBTQ people and sex workers, created conditions for HIV to spread. By the 2010s, Russia had one of the fastest-growing HIV epidemics in the world. In contrast, countries that embraced evidence-based approaches saw remarkable results. Thailand's 100% condom program, which required condom use in all sex work establishments, dramatically reduced HIV transmission. Brazil's decision to provide free antiretroviral treatment to all citizens with HIV, regardless of ability to pay, served as a model for universal access. Australia's comprehensive approach, combining harm reduction, community engagement, and access to treatment, kept HIV rates relatively low despite having significant at-risk populations. These examples demonstrated that political will and comprehensive strategies could control HIV. The epidemic was never inevitable in any population. It spread where conditions allowed it to spread. Poverty, inequality, marginalization, stigma, lack of healthcare access, and political indifference created the environment where HIV thrived. The scientific quest for a cure and a vaccine continued, but progress was frustratingly slow. HIV is a uniquely difficult target for vaccines. The virus mutates rapidly, creating enormous diversity. It attacks the very immune system that vaccines are meant to activate. It integrates into the host genome, hiding in cellular reservoirs where drugs can't reach it. Dozens of vaccine candidates have been tested, and dozens have failed. The search for a cure faced similar challenges. A handful of people have been functionally cured of HIV, most famously Timothy Ray Brown, known as the Berlin patient. Brown had HIV and also developed leukemia. His cancer treatment involved destroying his immune system with chemotherapy and then rebuilding it with a bone marrow transplant. His doctor, Jiro Huta, deliberately chose a donor who had a rare genetic mutation that makes cells resistant to HIV infection. The transplant cured both Brown's cancer and his HIV. He lived without detectable virus and without taking antiretroviral drugs until he died of a recurrence of cancer in 2020. Brown's case proved that curing HIV was possible, but the procedure that cured him was incredibly risky, expensive, and complex. It's not a viable approach for the millions of people living with HIV. Researchers have been trying to replicate the success in ways that could be scaled up, but it's proven extraordinarily difficult. Gene therapy approaches are being explored. The idea is to modify a patient's own immune cells to make them resistant to HIV, similar to the natural resistance conferred by the mutation that the Berlin patient's donor had. Early results have been promising, but far from ready for widespread use. CRISPR and other gene editing technologies offer hope, but also raise ethical questions and practical challenges. Therapeutic vaccines, which would help people who already have HIV control the virus without daily medication, are another area of research. Some vaccines have shown the ability to temporarily reduce viral load or delay the need to restart treatment, but none have been effective enough to replace antiretroviral therapy. The kick-and-kill strategy aims to flush HIV out of its hiding places in the body and then eliminate it with drugs or the immune system. Latency-reversing agents can activate dormant HIV, making infected cells visible to the immune system. But the kill part has proven difficult. The immune system, even when boosted, hasn't been able to clear all the infected cells. Despite these challenges, the cure research continues. The possibility that HIV could someday be completely eliminated from the body drives scientists forward. Every small advance builds on previous knowledge. Every failed approach teaches something that informs the next attempt. Prevention research has had more immediate success. Beyond PrEP, which remains highly effective when taken as prescribed, researchers have developed other prevention tools. Injectable PrEP that lasts for months is now available, eliminating the need for daily pills. Vaginal rings that slowly release antiretroviral drugs provide women with a prevention method they can control. Post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP, allows people who may have been exposed to HIV to take medications within 72 hours to prevent infection. The concept of treatment as prevention has been operationalized through programs like Test and Treat, where everyone diagnosed with HIV is immediately started on treatment. This approach benefits both the individual and the community. The person with HIV stays healthier, and the community experiences reduced transmission. Models suggest that if enough people with HIV are diagnosed and virally suppressed through treatment, it's possible to end the epidemic even without a vaccine or cure. The goal of ending the AIDS epidemic has been articulated through various campaigns and initiatives. The United Nations set targets for 95-95-95. 95% of people with HIV knowing their status, 95% of those diagnosed receiving treatment, and 95% of those on treatment being virally suppressed. Some cities and countries have declared they've reached epidemic control, meaning new infections have declined to the point where the epidemic is no longer a public health crisis. But these victories are fragile and uneven. In the United States, for example, overall new infections have declined, but they remain stubbornly high among certain populations. Young Black, gay, and bisexual men continue to face HIV risk that is unconscionable. The South, often called the epicenter of the US epidemic, struggles with poverty, stigma, and limited access to healthcare. Rural areas face unique challenges including isolation, lack of HIV specialists, and concerns about confidentiality in small communities. Funding remains a perpetual issue. Domestic HIV programs constantly face budget cuts. International programs like PEPFAR depend on political support that can shift with elections. The Global Fund, which has saved millions of lives, requires ongoing contributions from donor countries. When the political will or the money isn't there, programs shrink, people lose access to treatment, prevention efforts falter, and the virus gains ground again. And now we need to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic intersected with the ongoing HIV epidemic in ways that were both eerily familiar and uniquely challenging. The lessons learned from HIV should have prepared the world for COVID-19. The importance of rapid response, the need for clear public health messaging, the value of community engagement, the necessity of addressing stigma, all of these have been learned painfully through HIV. In some ways, the response to COVID-19 benefited from HIV experience. The infrastructure for developing and testing vaccines and treatments have been built through decades of HIV research. The regulatory pathways for fast-tracking drugs in emergencies have been created by AIDS activists demanding faster access. The concept of social distancing and behavior change to prevent disease transmission had precedence in HIV prevention campaigns. But in other ways, the mistakes of the early AIDS response were repeated. Marginalized communities bore disproportionate burdens of COVID-19, just as they had with HIV. Misinformation and conspiracy theories spread. Political leaders downplayed the severity. Stigma attached to those who were infected. It was frustratingly familiar to anyone who had lived through the AIDS crisis. For people with HIV, COVID-19 posed specific concerns. Was HIV a risk factor for severe COVID-19? Would COVID vaccines be safe and effective for people with compromised immune systems? The answers, fortunately, were mostly reassuring. People with HIV who were on treatment and virally suppressed didn't appear to be at significantly higher risk. Vaccines worked, though sometimes required additional doses for immunocompromised individuals. But COVID-19 disrupted HIV services globally. Lockdowns made it difficult for people to access clinics. Supply chains for antiretroviral medications were strained. HIV testing declined dramatically as resources were diverted to COVID-19. Prevention services, including PrEP provision, were interrupted. The concern was that these disruptions would lead to increased HIV transmission and worse outcomes for people living with HIV. In some regions, these fears were realized. New HIV diagnoses increased in areas where testing and prevention services had been most severely disrupted. Treatment adherence suffered when people couldn't get to clinics or refill prescriptions. The dual burden of two pandemics strained healthcare systems that were already struggling. The parallels between COVID-19 and HIV sparked reflection. Both were novel viruses that caught the world off guard. Both required behavior change and public health interventions. Both generated fear and stigma, but there were also crucial differences. COVID-19 was transmitted through the air, making it far more contagious. It killed quickly, creating urgency that AIDS, with its longer progression, hadn't initially generated. And COVID-19 affected everyone, which meant resources and attention flowed quickly in ways they never had for HIV when it was perceived as a disease of marginalized groups. This difference in response was painful for AIDS survivors to watch. Vaccines for COVID-19 were developed and approved in less than a year. Billions of dollars poured into research and treatment. The entire world mobilized. And they couldn't help but wonder, what if that kind of response had happened in 1981? How many lives could have been saved if HIV had been treated with the urgency that COVID-19 received? Of course, the science was different. mRNA vaccine technology that enabled rapid COVID-19 vaccine development didn't exist in the 1980s. Understanding of virology and immunology was far more limited, but still, the question lingered. If HIV had primarily affected middle-class white heterosexuals instead of gay men, drug users, and people of color, would the response have been faster? Would more resources have been mobilized sooner? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, seems to be yes. This brings us to the current moment, where we are 4 decades into the HIV epidemic with both tremendous progress and ongoing challenges. Globally, about 78 million people have been infected with HIV since the epidemic began. Nearly 40 million have died. That's almost 40 million individual human lives, each one a universe of experiences, relationships, dreams, and potential. The scale is hard to comprehend. About 38 million people are currently living with HIV worldwide. 28 million of them are accessing treatment. That means 10 million people who know they're positive still aren't getting the medications they need. And there are millions more who don't know their status, who have HIV but have never been tested. Every year, about 1.5 million people become newly infected with HIV. That number has declined significantly from the peak of the epidemic, but it's still 1.5 million people every single year who acquire a virus that they'll carry for the rest of their lives. In certain populations and regions, infection rates are even increasing. The tools to end the AIDS epidemic exist. We have effective treatment that keeps people healthy and prevents transmission. We have PrEP that prevents infection. We have testing technology that can diagnose HIV quickly. We understand how the virus spreads and how to stop it. What we don't have is the global political will and resources to ensure that everyone, everywhere, has access to these tools. Inequality remains the defining factor. Rich countries have largely controlled their epidemics. Poor countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, continue to struggle. Within wealthy countries, marginalized communities face infection rates that would be considered emergency situations if they occurred in the general population. HIV finds and exploits vulnerability wherever it exists. The COVID-19 pandemic taught us that infectious diseases don't respect borders. A virus anywhere is a threat everywhere. The same is true for HIV. As long as the epidemic is raging in parts of the world, as long as people anywhere are being infected and dying, the global HIV epidemic is not over. If you've been listening to this entire history, staying with us through the darkness and the small lights of hope, through the tragedy and the resilience, thank you. This is the kind of deep, thorough exploration of history that Dreamless Timelines is all about. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Drop a comment and let us know what you think about this history, or what topics you'd like us to explore next. Your engagement truly helps us continue creating this content. Now, let's talk about where things stand today and what the future might hold. One of the most significant recent developments is the increasing focus on addressing social and structural drivers of HIV. It's become clear that you can't end an epidemic without addressing the conditions that make people vulnerable to it in the first place. Poverty, for instance, is a major driver of HIV risk. People living in poverty have less access to healthcare, less ability to negotiate safe sex, less food security, which affects health and immune function. Women may engage in transactional sex for survival. People may share needles for injecting drugs because they can't afford clean ones. Addressing poverty isn't typically thought of as an HIV intervention, but it absolutely is. Gender inequality is another crucial factor. In many parts of the world, women lack the power to insist on condom use or to leave relationships with partners who are putting them at risk. Young women and girls face age-disparate relationships with older men who are more likely to be HIV positive. Gender-based violence, including sexual violence, increases HIV risk and prevents women from accessing services. Empowering women and girls, ensuring they have education, economic opportunity, and bodily autonomy, these are HIV prevention strategies. Criminalization and discrimination continue to drive the epidemic underground. In many countries, same-sex relationships are criminalized, making it impossible for gay and bisexual men to access services without risking arrest. Sex work is criminalized in ways that increase risk rather than protecting sex workers. Drug use is treated as a criminal issue rather than a health issue, pushing people who inject drugs away from harm reduction services. Transgender people face violence and discrimination that limits their access to healthcare. When people fear arrest, violence, or discrimination, they don't get tested, they don't seek treatment, they don't carry condoms or clean needles. The stigma and legal risks become barriers between people and the services that could save their lives. Decriminalization, protection of human rights, and addressing stigma aren't soft, optional add-ons to HIV programming. They're essential to epidemic control. HIV community has been at the forefront of advocating for a health approach to drug policy. Harm reduction, which includes needle and syringe programs, opioid substitution therapy, and safe consumption sites, has been proven over and over again to reduce HIV transmission without increasing drug use. Countries that embrace harm reduction have much lower rates of HIV among people who inject drugs compared to countries that rely primarily on criminalization and punishment. Portugal's decriminalization of personal drug possession and investment in treatment and harm reduction services led to dramatic declines in drug-related deaths and HIV infections among people who inject drugs. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment program provided pharmaceutical-grade heroin to people with severe addiction in supervised medical settings, resulting in better health outcomes and reduced crime. These approaches work. They save lives. But they require acknowledging that people who use drugs are human beings deserving of health services, not criminals deserving of punishment. The intersectionality of HIV risk became increasingly recognized. People often face multiple, overlapping vulnerabilities. A Black transgender woman who does sex work faces HIV risk from her race, her gender identity, and her work, compounded by poverty, criminalization, and discrimination. Effective HIV responses need to address these interconnected factors, not just focus narrowly on the virus itself. Community-led responses have been critical to every success in HIV prevention and treatment. From the earliest days of the epidemic, communities most affected by HIV have organized to care for their own, to demand resources, to innovate solutions. Peer navigators, people with lived experience of HIV who help others access care, have been shown to improve outcomes. Community health workers who understand cultural and linguistic barriers can reach populations that traditional healthcare systems miss. The involvement of people living with HIV in all aspects of HIV response isn't just ethically right, it's strategically essential. They understand the barriers and challenges in ways that outsiders never can. They have credibility with communities that may distrust government or medical authorities. The principle of nothing about us without us emerged from disability rights activism, but was enthusiastically adopted by HIV activists. As we move deeper into the 21st century, new challenges and opportunities are emerging. Long-term survival with HIV is creating a population agging with the virus. People who were infected in the 1980s and 1990s and survived thanks to HAART are now in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They face the normal health challenges of agging plus the long-term effects of HIV and decades of antiretroviral therapy. HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders affect some people with HIV, even those who are virally suppressed on treatment. Cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, bone density loss, kidney and liver problems all occur at higher rates in people with HIV. Whether this is due to the virus itself, the medications, inflammation caused by ongoing low-level immune activation, or a combination of factors is still being researched. The phenomenon of accelerated agging in people with HIV has become a concern. Some studies suggest that the biological age of people with HIV is older than their chronological age. The implications for long-term care, healthcare costs, and quality of life are significant. The generation that survived the plague years only to face new challenges in their later decades. Mental health has gained recognition as a critical component of HIV care. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use disorders. These are all more common among people with HIV than in the general population. And they're not just side issues, they directly affect HIV outcomes. Depression can make it harder to adhere to medications. PTSD can make clinic visits triggering. Untreated mental health and substance use issues are barriers to staying in care. Integrated care models that address HIV, mental health, substance use, and other health needs together are more effective than siloed approaches where someone has to go to different places for different services. But integrated care requires resources and coordination that not all healthcare systems can provide. The question of who pays for HIV care remains contentious. In the United States, a patchwork of public and private insurance, government programs like Medicaid and the Ryan White Care Act, and pharmaceutical assistance programs keeps most people in treatment. But the system is complex and fragile. Changes to insurance coverage or cuts to public programs can leave people without access to medications. Globally, donor funding for HIV has plateaued or declined in recent years. At the same time, countries that were previously recipients of aid are being asked to take on more of their own HIV program funding as they develop economically. The transition from donor-funded to domestically funded programs is challenging. Countries may lack the resources or may choose to allocate funding to other priorities. The sustainability of the global HIV response is uncertain. The massive scale-up of treatment that happened in the 2000s and 2010s was possible because donor countries, particularly the United States through PEPFAR, provided billions of dollars. That generosity has saved millions of lives, but it was always intended to be temporary, a bridge to countries developing their own sustainable programs. Whether that transition can happen without devastating setbacks remains to be seen. Innovation continues to drive progress. Long-acting injectable antiretrovirals that only need to be given every 2 months are now available in some countries. These offer an alternative for people who struggle with daily pills. Implantable devices that release medication over months or even a year are in development. The goal is to reduce the burden of treatment, making it easier for people to stay suppressed and healthy. Broadly neutralizing antibodies, which can recognize and neutralize many different strains of HIV, are being explored as both treatment and prevention. Some people with HIV naturally produce these antibodies after years of infection. If these antibodies can be manufactured and given to people, they might offer long-lasting protection against HIV or even contribute to cure strategy. The concept of HIV remission, rather than complete cure, has gained traction. If people could stop taking antiretroviral drugs and remain healthy without detectable virus for years, even if the virus wasn't completely eliminated from the body, that would be a huge advance. It would reduce medication burden, side effects, and cost. Several approaches aimed at achieving long-term remission are being tested. The role of the microbiome, the community of bacteria and other microorganisms living in and on our bodies, in HIV infection and disease progression, is an emerging area of research. The gut microbiome appears to be disrupted in people with HIV, and this disruption may contribute to inflammation and immune activation. Whether modifying the microbiome could improve outcomes is being investigated. Nanotechnology offers potential for targeted drug delivery, diagnostics, and even therapeutic vaccines. Nanoparticles can be designed to deliver medications specifically to infected cells or to stimulate immune responses in precise ways. The field is still early but promising. CRISPR and other gene editing technologies continue to advance. The ability to precisely edit genes opens up possibilities for making immune cells resistant to HIV, for cutting HIV DNA out of infected cells, for fixing genetic factors that make people more susceptible to HIV. The ethical, safety, and technical challenges are enormous, but the potential is equally vast. As we think about the future, it's worth reflecting on how far we've come. In 1981, HIV was a mysterious killer that medicine couldn't identify, couldn't treat, couldn't prevent. Today, we can diagnose HIV with a finger prick in 20 minutes. We can prevent infection with a daily pill or periodic injection. We can suppress the virus to undetectable levels with 1 pill a day. We can prevent mother-to-child transmission with treatment. We've proven that ending the epidemic is possible. But we haven't done it yet. We have the tools but not the will. We have the knowledge but not the implementation. We understand what needs to happen but haven't made it happen everywhere for everyone. The remaining barriers are political, economic, and social. They're about priorities and resources, about whether we value all human lives equally regardless of who people are or where they live, about whether we're willing to address the underlying conditions that create vulnerability, about whether we can overcome stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. The AIDS epidemic revealed truths about our societies that many would have preferred to keep hidden. It exposed how we treat our most vulnerable. It showed the consequences of discrimination and neglect. It demonstrated that public health and human rights are inseparable. It also revealed incredible human capacity for resilience, compassion, and courage. The activists who fought when they were dying, the volunteers who cared for the sick when nobody else would, the researchers who dedicated their careers to solving an impossible puzzle, the artists who created beauty in the midst of horror, the ordinary people who showed extraordinary love. The generation most affected by HIV in the early years fought for their lives, and for the principle that their lives mattered. They didn't just save themselves, they changed the world. The advances in patient rights, in rapid drug development, in global health equity, in LGBTQ equality, all of these were pushed forward by the AIDS crisis and the response to it. The activists of ACTUP weren't polite. They were angry, disruptive, confrontational. They had to be. Politeness wasn't saving lives. Waiting patiently for systems to change wasn't an option when people were dying by the thousands. They demanded action and refused to be ignored. Their tactics worked. They changed policies, accelerated research, saved lives. The lesson for other movements is clear. Those most affected by injustice must lead the fight to change it. Outsiders can support, can ally, can contribute. But the people who are living with the consequences of failed policies or discrimination or neglect, they're the ones who know what needs to change and why it matters. The AIDS epidemic also taught us about the power of community. In the darkest times, people came together. They created support systems, care networks, advocacy organizations. They didn't wait for help from above, they helped each other. The model of community-based organizations responding to health crises has been replicated for other diseases and issues. The cultural impact of AIDS is still being processed. An entire generation of artists, musicians, writers, performers, designers was decimated. The creative work that was never created, the mentorship that never happened, the cultural movements that were cut short will never know what was lost. But we have the work that was created, often in the shadow of death, work that was infused with urgency and truth because the creators knew they might not have much time. The art that emerged from the AIDS crisis, whether it was Keith Haring's activism, David Wojnarowicz's rage, the AIDS Memorial Quilt's commemoration, or countless other works, serves as a historical record and a memorial. It ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their lives and deaths meant something. The literature of AIDS includes not just non-fiction accounts like "And the Band Played On," but also fiction, poetry, drama. Tony Kushner's Angels in America is an epic two-part play that grapples with AIDS, politics, religion, identity, and American society. Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart dramatized the early AIDS crisis and the fight for recognition and resources. Edmund White, Paul Monette, Mark Doty, and so many others wrote about life, love, death, and survival in the age of AIDS. These works ensure that future generations can understand what it was like to live through the epidemic. They preserve the emotional truth of the experience in ways that statistics and timelines cannot. They humanize the millions who died, giving faces and stories to numbers that would otherwise be abstract. The AIDS epidemic also influenced popular culture in more diffuse ways. It changed conversations about sexuality and sexual health. It brought discussions of condoms and safe sex into mainstream media. It forced acknowledgement of LGBTQ people and lives, even if that acknowledgement was often driven by fear and stigma. It made illness and caregiving visible in new ways. The epidemic intersected with and influenced the gay rights movement in complex ways. On one hand, it set back progress as homophobia intensified and resources were diverted from civil rights battles to survival. On the other hand, it forced LGBTQ people to become visible and organized in unprecedented ways. The community infrastructure built to fight AIDS became a platform for fighting discrimination. The path from the AIDS crisis to marriage equality isn't straight, but there are connections. The injustices faced by same-sex partners during the epidemic made the need for relationship recognition painfully clear. The organizing skills and political power built through AIDS advocacy transferred to other fights. The allies who were moved by the suffering of people with AIDS became supporters of broader LGBTQ equality. As we approach the end of this long journey through AIDS history, it's important to acknowledge that for many people, the epidemic isn't history at all. It's ongoing reality. People are still being diagnosed with HIV every day. People are still dying of AIDS, especially in parts of the world with limited treatment access. Long-term survivors are still living with the physical and psychological consequences of decades with the virus. For those survivors, particularly gay and bisexual men who came of age in the 1980s and 1990s, the trauma is ever present. They carry ghosts. They remember friends, lovers, entire social circles that were erased. They live with survivors' guilt, asking themselves why they're still here when so many aren't. They navigate a world that has largely moved on from AIDS while they cannot and will not forget. There's something called historical trauma, the idea that traumatic events can affect not just those who lived through them, but subsequent generations. The children of Holocaust survivors, descendants of enslaved people, indigenous communities dealing with the legacy of genocide and forced assimilation, they all carry echoes of traumas they didn't directly experience. The question for the LGBTQ community is whether AIDS trauma is being transmitted to younger generations, and if so, how. Gay men in their 20s today didn't live through the plague years, but they exist in communities and cultures that were shaped by that loss. The institutions, social norms, relationship patterns, even the demography of the community was affected by AIDS. They're navigating a landscape carved by a crisis they didn't experience. Some older gay men worry that younger people don't understand the stakes, don't appreciate what was lost, don't maintain enough fear of HIV. Younger people sometimes feel burdened by a history that isn't theirs, exhausted by being told they're not doing enough to remember, or that their relationship with HIV isn't serious enough. Both perspectives are valid. The goal shouldn't be to make younger generations feel guilty or to force them to carry trauma that isn't theirs. But there is value in understanding history, in knowing the battles that were fought, in honoring those who didn't survive. There's a balance between remembrance and living in the present, between learning from the past and not being trapped by it. Education is crucial. LGBTQ history, including AIDS history, should be taught in schools. Young people should learn about the epidemic not as a morality tale, but as a complex historical event with medical, political, social, and cultural dimensions. They should know about the activism, the solidarity, the losses, and the resilience. They should know that HIV is still a risk, that prevention and testing and treatment are still important. But they should also know that being HIV positive is not a death sentence anymore, that people with HIV can live long, healthy lives, that stigma and discrimination are often more harmful than the virus itself. The narrative around HIV needs to evolve. It can't remain stuck in the tragedy of the 1980s, but it also can't pretend that everything is fine now. The reality is complicated. Tremendous progress has been made, and significant challenges remain. Both things are true simultaneously. Looking forward, what will it take to actually end the AIDS epidemic? The targets are clear. Diagnose everyone with HIV, get everyone into treatment, support everyone to stay virally suppressed, provide prevention tools to everyone at risk, address the social and structural factors that create vulnerability. It's technically possible, the tools exist, but it requires sustained commitment, adequate funding, political will, and addressing inequality. It requires healthcare systems that can reach marginalized populations. It requires legal and policy changes to decriminalize behaviors and identities that drive people underground. It requires confronting stigma in all its forms. Some cities and countries have achieved epidemic control, proving it can be done. Australia, for instance, has virtually eliminated HIV transmission among gay and bisexual men through a comprehensive approach. San Francisco has seen dramatic declines in new infections. These successes show what's possible with resources, community engagement, and evidence-based interventions. But successes are fragile. They require ongoing investment and can be reversed if attention or funding declines. Complacency is the enemy. As long as people are becoming infected, the epidemic isn't over. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted HIV services and shifted attention and resources. The impact of those disruptions is still being measured. There's concern that progress made over the past decade could be set back. Conversely, some of the innovations developed for COVID-19 response, like telemedicine and home-based testing, could be adapted to strengthen HIV services. One thing the COVID-19 pandemic made clear is that no country is an island when it comes to infectious diseases. Global health security requires addressing epidemics everywhere. The resources and technology to end AIDS exist, but they're not being deployed equitably. As long as that inequality persists, the epidemic will continue. The ethical obligation is clear. We have the ability to prevent suffering and death. Choosing not to do so, whether through neglect, discrimination, or inadequate resource allocation, is a moral failure. The people who continue to be infected with HIV, who lack access to treatment, who die from AIDS, they're not statistics. They're human beings whose lives have value. The AIDS epidemic has been described as a plague, a genocide, a holocaust, a tragedy, and a crisis. It's been all of those things, but it's also been a story of survival, resistance, innovation, and love. It's shown the worst of humanity in the discrimination, neglect, and cruelty directed at people with AIDS. And it's shown the best of humanity in the compassion, courage, and determination of those who fought back. As we sit here in 2025, more than 40 years after the first recognized cases, we're at a crossroads. We have the tools to end AIDS as a public health threat. Whether we will actually do it depends on choices that are being made right now, about funding priorities, about political will, about whether we're willing to address the inequality and discrimination that drive the epidemic. History will judge us by what we do next. We know what needs to be done. The question is whether we'll do it, whether we'll commit the resources, whether we'll center the communities most affected, whether we'll dismantle the legal and social barriers that prevent people from accessing prevention and treatment, whether we value all lives equally regardless of who people are, where they live, or how they were infected. The people who died in the early years of the epidemic, who didn't have treatment options, who were abandoned by their government and society, they deserve to have their deaths mean something. The way to honor them is to ensure that nobody else has to die from a preventable, treatable disease. The way to honor them is to build a world where everyone has access to the tools they need to stay healthy. The activists who fought for recognition, for resources, for dignity, they showed what's possible when people refuse to accept injustice. They changed policies, shifted culture, saved millions of lives. Their legacy is not just the specific victories they won, but the proof that determined people demanding change can actually achieve it. The survivors, those still living with HIV or living with the memories of those years, carry forward the history and the lessons. They remember when there was no treatment, when an HIV diagnosis meant death. They appreciate the miracle of still being alive, and many of them continue to fight, to advocate, to ensure that others benefit from the progress they've helped achieve. As this story comes to its natural resting point, I want to take a moment to acknowledge you, the listener who has stayed with us through this entire journey. 4 hours is a long time to spend with a single story, especially one as heavy as the AIDS epidemic. If you're still here, still listening, it means something. It means you care about understanding history, about bearing witness to those who suffered, about learning from the past. If you haven't already subscribed to Dreamless Timelines, I'd be grateful if you would. These deep historical explorations take tremendous time and research, and your subscription and engagement help us continue creating them. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your reflections, or your own connections to this history. Maybe you lived through these years. Maybe you lost someone to AIDS. Maybe this is all new information to you. Whatever your relationship to this story, I'd love to hear from you. And please hit that like button. It seems like such a small thing, but it helps the algorithm show this video to others who might benefit from hearing this history. The more people who understand what happened during the AIDS epidemic, the better equipped we are to prevent history from repeating itself. The story of AIDS is ultimately a story about how we treat each other, how we respond when a crisis emerges, whether we extend compassion to those who are suffering or whether we judge and condemn, whether we let fear drive us or whether we lead with science and humanity. It's a story about the power of community to take care of its own when nobody else will, about how activism can change the world, about how love persists even in the face of death, about how people can endure unimaginable loss and still fight for a better future. It's a story about medical innovation, about how researchers pursued a virus they couldn't see with tools that didn't exist yet, about how treatments were developed against incredible odds, about how science advanced more in a few decades than it had in the previous century, driven by the urgency of people dying. And it's a story that isn't over. Every day people are diagnosed with HIV. Every day people start treatment and achieve viral suppression. Every day people take PrEP and protect themselves from infection. Every day researchers work toward a cure or a vaccine. Every day activists fight for justice and equity. The epidemic continues, but so does the response. The arc of this history, if it has one, bends toward progress. From no treatment to effective treatment. From rapid death to chronic manageable condition. From millions of new infections annually to declining numbers in many regions. From complete ignorance about transmission to sophisticated understanding. From silence and stigma to visibility and advocacy. But progress isn't inevitable. It's the result of choices and work and sacrifice. The progress we've seen came because people demanded it, because researchers dedicated their lives to it, because communities organized and refused to be ignored. The progress we still need will only come if we continue making those same efforts. There's a generation of people who never got to see the progress that came after their deaths. They died in the 1980s and early 1990s when there was no effective treatment. They endured suffering that people diagnosed today will never have to face. Their deaths weren't inevitable. With earlier action, with more resources, with less discrimination, many of them would have survived. We owe them a debt. The debt is paid by ensuring that their deaths were not in vain, by using the tools we now have to save lives, by building a world where everyone, everywhere, has access to prevention and treatment, by ending stigma and discrimination, by actually ending the AIDS epidemic. It's possible, not easy, but possible. We've proven we can do it in specific places with specific populations. Now we need to do it everywhere, for everyone. That's the challenge, that's the goal, that's how this story should end. But the ending is still being written. It will be written by policymakers deciding how to allocate resources, by researchers pursuing the next breakthrough, by community organizers reaching vulnerable populations, by individuals making choices about their health and their communities, by all of us in small and large ways. If you take one thing from this history, let it be this. What happens during epidemics, who lives and who dies, isn't random. It's shaped by policy, by resources, by whether society values certain lives over others. And it's shaped by resistance, by people refusing to accept injustice, by communities taking care of their own. The AIDS epidemic didn't have to be as devastating as it was. Earlier action could have saved hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of lives. But it was as devastating as it was because of choices made and not made, because of who was valued and who wasn't, because of stigma and fear and prejudice. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. We can choose to be better. We can choose to value all lives. We can choose to respond to health crises with urgency and compassion rather than judgment and delay. We can choose to build systems that actually serve everyone, not just the privileged. As you drift off to sleep, think about the people we've met in this story. The early patients whose names we never learned, the activists who chained themselves to buildings, the volunteers who sat with the dying, the researchers who worked around the clock, the long-term survivors still carrying the weight of what they experienced. Think about what they endured, what they fought for, what they achieved. Think about what's still to be done. And tomorrow, or whenever you wake, maybe there's some small way you can contribute to making the world a little more just, a little more compassionate, a little more willing to care for the most vulnerable among us. That's how epidemics end, not just with medicine and science, though those are crucial, but with solidarity, with human connection, with the collective decision that every life matters. The AIDS epidemic has been the 20th century's plague and the ongoing 21st century's challenge. It has killed tens of millions. It has transformed medicine and activism. It has revealed truths about our societies that we needed to see. It has tested our capacity for compassion and our commitment to justice. And it continues, every day, every diagnosis, every life saved by treatment, every infection prevented, every activist demanding better, every researcher pursuing answers, every person with HIV living fully and openly, every ally standing in solidarity. This is the story we've told tonight, the complete history of the AIDS epidemic, though of course no history is ever truly complete. There are millions of individual stories within this larger narrative, countless moments of heartbreak and hope, loss and love, despair and determination. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough to hear this history. Thank you for staying awake with me through the darkness, learning about one of humanity's greatest challenges and how we're still working to overcome it. Sleep well, knowing that while the story is tragic, it's also one of incredible resilience and hope. And when you wake, the work of ending AIDS continues, with or without us. The question is whether we'll be part of making that ending happen. Until next time, this has been Dreamless Timelines, bringing you the histories that shape our world, told in the quiet hours when the mind is open and the heart is listening. Good night.